Racism, you see, is a national security threat. It's a national security threat. Really, Sheila Jackson Lee? Tell us how racism is a national security threat. Speak slowly. We've got plenty of time. But of course, she won't do that. She's got no argument. She's got no facts. She doesn't even have a sincere belief in what she's saying. It's absurd, and she knows it. And by the way, Sheila Jackson Lee doesn't want to protect a country she despises from national security threats. Why would she want to do that? No, that's not the point. What she's doing here every day is leveling a racial attack, a blood libel against an entire group of Americans while simultaneously pretending to be the victim of attacks from that same group. Stop hitting me, she howls as she punches you in the face. It's such a common tactic at this point, used constantly by Al Sharpton, by the ADL, by so many others, that you may not even notice it anymore. But it's still disgusting, it's still immoral, it's still divisive. Here's Joe Biden doing it.
And finally, we're confronting the stains of what remains the deep stain in the soul of the nation: hate and white supremacy. You know, there's a tough through line of subjugation and enslaved people from our earliest days to the reigns of radicalized terror, the KKK, to Dr. King being assassinated, and the violent, deadly insurrection on the Capitol 9 months ago. It was about white supremacy, in my view.
Speaking of blood libel, because that's what it is, protesting the 2020 election results is the same as slavery, as the KKK. It's the same as murdering Martin Luther King. It's all white supremacy, declares Joe Biden without defining the term. Now, you may recall when Joe Biden said that. You probably dismissed it at the time as ridiculous, as the rantings of a senile partisan, and of course that's what it was. But you should also keep in mind that Joe Biden did not say that by accident. It wasn't an ad lib, off the cuff. No, his staff signed off on that speech. They wrote it, they read it before he read it. And they wrote it for a reason. When the President of the United States identifies a threat to this country, his many federal agencies, the biggest in the world, swing into action to neutralize that threat. That's how the system works, as Joe Biden's staff well knows. So, in fact, when Joe Biden likens you to Al-Qaeda or the Klan, it's not a small thing at all. It has implications. So here's Sheila Jackson Lee from last week in a not unrelated clip calling for the renewal of the Patriot Act. Watch.
I remember after 9/11 when we all worked together to ensure the protection of the American people through the Patriot Act and dealing with the FISA courts. We worked together because truth is important.
Now, that's kind of strange if you think about it. So why would Sheila Jackson Lee, a self-described liberal, find herself last week praising the secret government courts that liberals once opposed passionately on the grounds that those courts could be used to destroy the constitutional rights of Americans without anyone knowing about it? Secret courts? Liberals were against secret courts, and now the chief liberal in Congress is strongly for secret courts. What's going on here? Why? Well, because those secret courts turn out to be a highly effective way to silence the critics of the Democratic Party, to silence those so-called white supremacists Joe Biden's always yelling about, not all of whom, by the way, are white. You don't have to be white to be a white supremacist. You just have to oppose the agenda. And of course, Sheila Jackson Lee knows that very well, and that's why she wants to renew the Patriot Act indefinitely. And there are enough dumb Republicans that she may be able to. But Sheila Jackson Lee would like to go a lot further than that. Lee has just introduced a bill called the Leading Against White Supremacy Act of 2023. Now, it's not an exaggeration to say this single bill would do more to criminalize speech, previously constitutionally guaranteed speech, than any other piece of legislation that has been proposed in the entire history of this country. That's not an overstatement at all, and to prove it, we're going to read directly from the bill. Here it is, quote, "A conspiracy to engage in white supremacy-inspired hate crime shall be determined to exist between two or more persons, at least one of whom published material advancing white supremacy, white supremacist ideology, antagonism based on, quote, replacement theory, or hate speech that vilifies or is otherwise directed against any non-white person or group," end quote. Now, nowhere in the legislation is the term white supremacy or white supremacist ideology ever defined. Of course it's never defined. It's left open. It's subjective. Anything can be white supremacy. But the bill does specifically point to something called replacement theory, white supremacist ideology. If you engage in either one of them, you go to federal prison, possibly for a very long time. So all that's required under this piece of legislation, which has not been laughed out of Congress yet, all that's required is that your political opinions, quote, could, as determined by a reasonable person, motivate actions by a person predisposed to engaging in a white supremacy-inspired hate crime. So what would qualify as a felony under this law? Well, virtually everything, but among them would be pointing out that Democratic Party politicians, including Chuck Schumer, the leading Senate Democrat, have long bragged that they are flooding this country with immigrants in order to change the demography to maintain political power for themselves. They've said that many times, they've written it, they've bragged about it on camera, but if you notice it under this bill, you would be criminally responsible for the violent acts of people you have never met, and you would go to jail for terrorism. Now, what's most interesting about this bill is that it's race-specific. Nothing in Sheila Jackson Lee's legislation would apply to, say, black supremacy or murder sprees by people who aren't white supremacists, the massacre in Waukesha, for example. So that means that Democratic Party politicians can continue to say whatever they want with impunity. The First Amendment still applies to them, but not to anyone who doesn't vote for them. So that's the definition of tyranny. It's horrifying. It's a direct attack on the Bill of Rights, on our core freedoms guaranteed by the U.S. government for 250 years. We shouldn't be surprised by this, however, because it's consistent with what Biden has promised since the day he got into office. And the promise was that race-blind justice, which is the entire foundation of the rule of law in the West, has been for centuries, is done. The new model, South Africa. That's the new model, South Africa, a country we never talk about because no one wants to admit what's happened there over the past 29 years.